Well, here you can see how the different indicators the indexes are using are basically distributed. What different indexes are taken as indicators. GEI, this is Gender Equality Index of Erasmus University. It takes 5% and 57% of the resources and institutions. I mean, institutions means laws and institutional regulations. And 33% is based on capabilities and 5% on functionings. So still it's significantly inclined. I mean, institutions significantly inclined on institutions, whether there's an infrastructure that could guarantee the inequality, and there are some other. And then it, well, as a second important indicator, it takes capabilities as its variables. GEI, that was United Nations, the United Nations indicator, completely focused on the capabilities and functionings, while SIGI, that's OECD, Social Institutions and Gender Index, completely focus on that infrastructure. So it is a even more concentrated version of GEI. And then you have GGGI, this is Global Gender Gap Index of World Economic Forum. It significantly leans on the capabilities, still has also some indicators related to resources and institutions, while WEOI, which is the Women Economic Opportunity Index, that is mainly leaning on institutions, but also resources, basically, and to some extent, very little on the capabilities and the functionings. There is also much difference on the actual variables they contain, and there I think it's interesting. It also becomes interesting. So let's go down. So this is GEI, the first one, and you see the variables. I mean, there are many of them. For example, rating on level women's economic rights, percentage of respondents who tend to agree or strongly women should have the same change of being elected as political office as men. I mean, that's not an actual rule, but the beliefs, which is also part of the infrastructure. I mean, whether people believe this is right or not wrong. And then you have things like, for example, ratio of female and male primary school enrollment. Note that ratio doesn't give the overall level. Both male and female students might be low, but if the ratio is similar, at least they might be equal in that sense. This is GEI. As you see, much less indicators are there. Maternal fertility, adolescent fertility, maternal mortality, how many women die at birth. Adolescent fertility, how might underage women become pregnant. Education attainment second and above. Parliamentary representation and labor force participation. Note here, it looks, I don't know whether it looks to percentage. It might also look how much women are attaining to the education as a whole. In that sense, I mean, if both men and women have low education, women would still have a low development level as a whole. If it looks to that, it doesn't look to the inequality, but it looks to the overall development level of the woman. This is SIGI. Kind of a moderate number of indicators are there. This is GGI. And the last one, this is WEOI. As you see, there are many indicators there also. And this was our graph. Now, how to connect all of these indicators, and there are also different methods. For example, we might have inequality aversion, which basically means that if inequality increases for any indicator, there is a large inequality between countries. The countries that are better off in that in that indicator might be rewarded. Which means, I mean, if there's a large inequality in education, being better in education will increase the index, the level of, or let's say, the level of development of women according to the index, or level of equality between men and women according to the index. You might put that, or you might not put that. That it might be, maybe, I mean, a country might be not that good. In very good at education, but maybe bad at something on which, in general, other countries are not that much unequal. For example, politically it might be very bad, but politically all other countries might be very close to each other, so that country might not be punished for that political inequality as severely as it would for the education inequality. But on the other hand, being better at things in which countries are unequal might be more difficult and be rewarded more. I mean, there's a discussion on that. Compensating one variable with another, you have another one variable that is taken place of another variable. That's one thing, and overall weight of the variables is another thing. You might have variables that are representing, showing, for example, indirectly. For example, I don't know, the health level of the woman. For example, in order to measure health level, you might have life expectancy, even though it doesn't represent it in perfect way. And then you have overall weight of the variables, which is another question. I mean, how do you weight the variables? You might weight them equally, maybe, or you might have different ways of weighting them. For example, as I said, inequality aversion is one way of changing the weights according to the inequality level of the of that variable between the countries at a certain period of the history, or for a certain data set. And then, of course, the one way of creating variables is creating subranks, creating 3 other indexes, and then combining those indexes. And another question is, of course, I mean, even if we give them same weight, do we take arithmetic mean or geometric mean? Is another question to be asked. To ask basically. So these are some introductory difficulties on the methodology of combining the indexes. You can read it and you can see there is more on that actually. For example, one question is, if men are better at certain aspects, should we should we assume if we are measuring inequality, should we assume that the men and women are equal, or should we basically take that also a type of inequality? If men are worse for some indicator, basically, is it also a part of inequality, gender inequality, or should we basically assume that for those indicators, men and women are equal to each other? That's the discussion between the indicators. You can see that discussion. So one interesting way to look to the indicators, and that would be our last slide, is how different variables are affecting, correlated with our indicators. Infant mortality rate, the early death of children, is correlated with all of the variables and very significantly correlated. But HIV prevalence of female, how much a woman can be protected from female, these are only correlated with our first variables. Um, uh, the ones that are more resource based and basically institution based are not correlated with the HIV. So maybe the resources and the institutions do not materialize necessarily in actual, at least HIV protection. In HIV protection case, they might not necessarily materializing. So basically, in order to see whether there's a basically actual HIV protection, we should maybe need to look to capabilities directly. When you look to education public spending, that's overall public spending, you see the last two are where we look to resources are more significant. So overall, of course, overall public spending per GDP is more related to the resources, not capabilities, basically. Where we look to the relative capabilities of the woman, of course. Not overall capabilities of everyone in society. So in that sense, overall measurement of the resources is more relevant. So this is a very brief look to the indicators, basically. And this week's discussion is basically measuring gender inequality, both whether it is possible or not, since it is a at first look a qualitative indicator, but then also what are best ways to measure it. And I think Staveren's article is a good starting point. You can read it in more detail, and then you can look to other resources and discuss it. So it's an interesting, in my opinion, one of the most interesting articles of the course. Next time we will look to some actual data related to gender inequality. I hope to see you in the next lecture, and as always, I hope you will stay healthy.